Welcome back to the channel today, guys. Today we are going to do my favorite part of any modeling experience, and that is weathering. So much fun. But first, we're going to take our Harder & Steenbeck detail airbrush, and we're going to pre-shade, and we're also going to contrast with some nice grime colors. So first, starting off, what you're going to want to do is take the base paint and kind of just mix it with a nice mixture of buff to make it a little bit lighter. Now in the video, if it looks a little bit lighter, it's okay. It dries to a little bit darker. But what you're going to want to do is pretty much just, well, fade the base color. You know, tanks, when they're out in the sun, they fade color. So they're not usually a straight, uniform color. And you kind of want to accent this by doing some detail brushing. The reason why we're using this airbrush is because, well, it's a detail brush. You can get really, really tight into those details, as you see here. Now for our contrasting, what we're going to do is we're going to be mixing brown and black to make this dark, contrasty color. So that way you can really contrast some of the panel lines, some of the outlines. You're going to want to go low air pressure here and really just outline pretty much every part of the tank. You can see some of our pre-shade work on the rear of the turret there. I think it looks pretty good. But with this step, you're just going to want to pretty much outline every panel, every corner that you have, and other interesting parts of the model as well. What happens when you do this is you get a nice contrast between parts, so it makes the parts a little bit more interesting and a little bit more appealing to look at than just some boring, well, base color throughout the whole model. Really breaks the model up into parts. You can do this with literally every single part of the model that you like. You have bolts, rivets, panel lines, you name it, you can throw this on there, and at the end of the day, it will look pretty good, and it will differentiate some of these details that the kit comes with, so that way you could just throw them onto your model, and it looks really good. You also want to get the bottom. Obviously, this adds to the weathering experience simply because it does fray those edges a little bit, and it looks like the tank has been worn through driving or, you know, weather, hence the term weathering. But it really does give that tank that extra little bit of detail that's really, really nice. And this is what you get after you're done post shading and griming, I call it. But next, what we're going to do is, if you think this tank looks great, we're going to completely destroy everything we've done with textured paint right here. This little bit of acrylic paint is water-based. We're also going to use some dried seagrass, so that way we can texture up this model a little bit. But with the texture paint, it is just a paint that you can slap on there and you can dilute with water. You just want to get the texture. We're not looking for color right now. With the seagrass and with the dirt, what we're going to do is we're going to add normal, well, weathering to this tank. So you see here on this panel, on this front fascia, we're going to have some real dirt and the simulated real grass on there to really add that extra bit of weathering. The textured paint isn't that pigmented, so it's not like big and clumpy. It has a very fine, almost like sandpapery feel to it. So this right here really allows us to add some details of bigger sections of dirt and bigger boulders that aren't so easily jostled loose by driving. Again, this is one of my most enjoyable parts. To put this all together, we're not going to use regular glue or cement. We're going to use VMS Sand and Ballast Freeze. Oh my goodness, it comes out very quick. This solution right here is acrylic based, and what it does is it just really binds all of these elements together and it adheres it to the model without doing any graying or destroying of the paint. It does leave a little bit of a glossy finish, but you can just fix that up with some either satin or matte varnish when you're done. And now we're going to add our mud texture. Again, we're not really looking for color here. Instead, we're just going to try to outline the places where mud would accumulate on this tank. So running gear, road wheels, drive sprocket, maybe some of the lower bits of the hull, tracks, we're going to do it as well. It's a really shame because if you guys see that decal that's there, well, say goodbye to that decal because it is going to be completely covered with mud and dust, and it's an element, unfortunately, of tank modeling that you have to kind of live with, that all your detailed work may not come to fruition. But you do all that detailing work so that way when you do this level of weathering, if you miss a spot or, you know, if you fail to really cover an area, it still has something interesting to look at. As in this post shading that you can still see on the side panel here. It's not going to get completely covered with mud that high up, but you don't just want this muddy texture and weathered paint into, well, nothingness, just a straight base color. It wouldn't look good. It wouldn't look good at all. And with this, you just want to use a, well, nonsense brush. This stuff will kind of destroy your brushes. The paint does recede just like regular paint, but this time it recedes with pigment. And you can clean it. You can clean it with water, but it does get a little bit difficult. Second step to this is, obviously, as you can see, we have a decent muddy texture going on the bottom there, and you just kind of want to accentuate the mud. Obviously, mud just doesn't come across this flat pattern. It splatters everywhere. And when you have rain, depending on the texture of the mud, depending on the viscosity of the mud, you will get some streaking. So that's pretty much what we're doing here. We're taking our base mud coat that we have there. We're going to take a smaller brush with water, since it is water soluble, and we're just going to, well, pretty much create streaks from the mud. If they're a little bit too heavy, you can add more water, and it acts as a eraser of sorts. But you don't want to leave it in a super streaky condition because that's kind of not realistic, but then you also don't want to just leave it empty like that right there. So we're going to show you the difference between that. And just gentle, light strokes in the direction of gravity, obviously. And again, if it's looking a little bit too thick in some places, you could just add some water, as I do right here. And you can just thin down those streaks, and it will look more realistic and more believable to the eye, too. This also gives the tank a pretty good amount of scale because of the muddy texture. Obviously, if you're thinking of mud and dirt, and you think of mud and dirt as it relates to, let's say, your car, well, I mean, we all know that those muddy chunks aren't so small sometimes. So this step right here adds further scale to the tank, making it look less like a plastic model and more like an actual driven vehicle. So what are we going to do with this? It's obviously a different color than our muddy texture, but you can see how it's stuck in place. These are just some gratuitous shots. As you can see, you have some muddy streaks as well as some pigmentation throughout the bottle, and it's pretty good. However, we still have a pretty stark contrast between the mud line and the rest of the tank. So we're going to take a Tamiya buff, which is the same color as the mud, and we're just going to post dust now. or as I like to call blending. You're just gonna blend that mud line with the rest of the tank, so that way it's not such a harsh contrast between, oh hey, here's some mud, there's some paint. Weathering doesn't really work like that. It also adds to some more faded paint, and we could say goodbye to that decal right there pretty much. But it does add just, again, that extra level of detail, that extra level of work to make our model so much more realistic and just so much more appealing to the eye. Just make it so much more interesting when you have a lot of colors, albeit colors that match what you're trying to do to the model. Going forward now, we're going to use some enamel washes, and this is where we're going to get most of our color from when it comes to relative to the color of mud that we're trying to get here. These enamel washes provide us with nice earth tones, and since they're enamel, they're not going to really damage any of the work that we've done so far, but you just kind of want to, and here's my favorite word, dab this paint in there. You don't want to overdo it because you still want a lot of those details, but you just want to pretty much colorize the model with this. And here's some very satisfying shots of doing just that. This enamel wash is, or does have, low surface tension, so it does really get into a lot of panel lines and air quotes rocks, as well as the sandy texture of the muddy paint. It is very easy to overdo this step. However, a lot of this enamel wash does a lot of the work for you in terms of self-blending and, well, what else does this really do for you in terms of making your model all types of pretty? Well, it blends itself, and it also dries into a more neutral color than when you lay it down. It stays a little wet for a little while, so you still have some time to manipulate the surfaces of these paints that you see here. So you could streak like we just did before, and we can just continue adding it throughout the model. But what else can we do to, well, really enhance this model? Well, we need some different colors too. So this brown looks great, but now we're going to do a dark brown. And the dark brown is really good because it adds some variation to the levels of brown that we have. So we started out with a light dusting coat, almost like a tan. Then we went to, I would say, like a medium or light brown, and now we're doing a dark brown, which will all come together and will add different levels of drying and or fresh mud to the model. And just a disclaimer warning, there are some very satisfying posts coming in. So just like with the lighter brown, you're going to want to pretty much just repeat the step over the same area, but in a smaller, not so broad area. So you want the darker mud to be more towards the bottom, then you want it to transition into like a medium brown, and then into our dusting that we did and our streaking as well. So just take a moment to appreciate these very satisfying moments. I just love weathering. And with this we can streak as well. And you don't want to miss the running gear of this video. Look at how this paint just covers. It's so beautiful. However, obviously this is where you're going to have the most fresh mud accumulation, so you're going to want to really kind of pile this dark mud color on to, well, the most muddy part of your tank. It just would make sense that way, wouldn't it? This is nice, but what else can we do? Well, mud splatters, and to replicate that, we're going to do some speckling. Pretty much with speckling, you put some paint on your brush, you take a harder object than your brush, and you just kind of flick paint to where you want it to be. This is very, very easy to overdo, and you do not want to overdo it because then it looks kind of unnatural unless you're looking for a super duper muddy tank. But these paints do dry, and they are, well, self-leveling in a way where they can kind of correct themselves. You want to do this throughout the whole tank. You don't want to overdo this step. Do not overdo this step. This step is very important. It will change things. For our tow cables, obviously tow cables don't get used that much, so they do have a tendency to weather, and you just want to take some chrome silver and you just want to brush it over because not all metal rusts equally. And this should be the end of absolutely destroying our beautifully painted, fresh Churchill tank. And as we come to the finish here, I actually really like this tank. I actually didn't think I was going to appreciate this build a lot, but I do. And a Tamiya kit goes a really long way, or a good tank kit just in general goes a really long way. Some really good weathering, some really good painting. We make our models interesting, and that's how we kind of want to portray it to everyone else, that our models are interesting. We're going to take a piece of plastic and we want to make it metal looking and weathered and driven and destroyed in some ways. It is unfortunate that we lose some of the detail in some of the work that we do, but I think our final product speaks for itself. I think it's so much more appealing to look at than just your base, normally painted model. And with the rust tones of the exhaust, the muddy textures, the different levels of brown and tan, we really, really get a nice model that we can hang up on the shelf and say, you know what used to be a pile of plastic is now this beautiful tank. Thank you guys for joining me in this production of this Churchill. Join in next week. Not really sure what the video is going to be, but I hope you're there for it, guys. Really appreciate all your time. Thanks for swinging by. See you guys next time.